Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video we'll be diving into some Subtlety Rogue for Mythic Plus dungeons. The Subtlety Rogue is by no means a popular spec, but I've been giving it a lot of research. I've been looking up different armories, looking up different Radar IO scores, runs, as well as watching a couple streamers who play Subtlety regularly to put this video together for you. And I feel like I have enough sufficient information in order to make this guide on Subtlety Rogue. Now, why would somebody want to play Subtlety? Subtlety Rogue, like any other spec, has a couple strengths, but also weaknesses. The strengths are gonna have to start with the absolutely ridiculous single target damage. If a Subtlety Rogue is geared enough, the amount of single target output you can do in just a few seconds with your burst is huge. If there is a boss or a mob that needs to be nuked down, like the beguiling adds, Subtlety is great for dispatching those mobs. Subtlety also plays a little bit better in AoE if you are focusing on single target. You can funnel your combo points that you generate from AoE, which you generate a lot of, into pure single target damage to single out an enemy that needs to be killed ASAP. This is, I guess, a bonus just for the fact that you are a rogue. You bring Shroud, you have Cheat Death, you have Stealth, you have Blind, you have Mobility, you have all the tools you have of a regular rogue, so any group is gonna find you useful no matter what spec you play. Some of the cons for Subtlety: you don't have great AoE output, so if there is another class that's better at sustained AoE damage, they are going to beat you in your overall numbers. Subtlety is also very gear dependent, so you're not really going to get a lot of value by having some decent gear and a couple essences. You gotta have basically the best in slot, the whole enchilada, in order to make Subtlety work. Let's go over the talents you'll be running if you want to play Subtlety in Mythic Plus dungeons. In the first row, Find Weakness is going to be our choice. We won't really be using Find Weakness unless we're doing particularly single target damage. In previous patches, Subtlety Rogues would maintain Find Weakness while doing AoE, but nowadays in Mythic Plus dungeons it's just not worth the value. But in your level 15 row, you can either go for Weapon Master or Find Weakness, whichever one you want. Find Weakness is going to be a little bit more difficult to play around, but it is going to be a stronger option. However, if you are struggling in single target situations as sub-rogue, Weapon Master might be easier for you to start with. In the level 30 row, we are going to be going with Night Stalker. The amount of energy Subtlety Rogue generates on its own does not warrant us to run Shadow Focus anymore, so we can splurge for a little bit extra damage. Level 45, we are going to be running with Deeper Stratagem. This will allow us to consume a lot more combo points and get far more damage out, particularly good in AoE situations. In level 60 row, Cheat Death is recommended, but you may run any one of those options. In the level 75 row, it's really a question of Shot in the Dark or Prey in the Weak. As Subtlety, I don't really find myself using stuns that often. There's other abilities for me to use my energy on, and stuns really come in at a clutch moment when I just need to stop an enemy from moving or casting. This is why I go with Shot in the Dark. That means during your Shadow Dance or Stealth, if you do need to cheap shot an enemy, that cheap shot is going to be free, allowing you to continue using your energy offensively. In the level 90 row, we're going to be playing with Dark Shadow. We are playing a very bursty build of Subtlety, so Dark Shadow is going to complement that playstyle. In a level 100 row, we'll be picking up Secret Technique. Secret Technique is advisable, and while it doesn't do that good of damage on bosses, it is very versatile. It works for big trash bags, but also like a 2-target cleave as well, which is gonna be an area where Subtlety just doesn't have that much leeway. But the Secret Technique overall is a great talent, and it will put out good damage throughout a dungeon run. When it comes to gear, it's advisable to sim your character, but the stats that are going to be the most important when it comes to Mythic Plus is your Mastery, which is Executioner, allowing our finishers to do more damage, and we're going to be throwing out a lot of Eviscerates. The stronger those are, the more damage we can put out. Afterwards, Critical Strike is a decent stat, and then Haste and Versatility end up being very equal to one another. Haste will allow you more energy regeneration so you can put out more abilities. Versatility, however, increases the damage of all your abilities, plus your Shadow Strikes as well as your Shuriken Storms. So the way I would stack up gear is I would stack Mastery heavy, followed by a healthy dosage of Critical Strike. When it comes to your enchants as well as gems, we are going to be following the same meta. We are going to put a bit of Mastery and a bit of Critical Strike. Again, it's a good idea to sim your character. Maybe your character has a lot of crit, but they need a bit more mastery in order to get the value on that damage. That means you can have all your crit gear with mastery and chance, and that'll supplement enough of that stat. For me, however, I'm at about a 50-50 with mastery and crit, so I try to put my points all over the place. But also most of my gear shares with Outlaw, so there are certain pieces I simply cannot swap out in the moment. We also need to talk about your trinkets for Subtlety Rogue. There are a couple options for you to run. Normally you would have one passive and one active trinket. One of the better passive trinkets is Deadeye Spyglass. It synergizes with the critical strike that it can give us, which is great in boss fights but also in trash pulls for mobs. Another solid trinket that would be a great unused is a Notorious Gladiator's Medallion, but also it is exactly the same trinket as the one from King's Rest. It gives you a fair amount of agility and a healthy dosage of versatility on a 2-minute cooldown, which you can utilize if you are going up against very high health, tough trash packs that you need to put everything into, but also synergizes really well onto boss fights. With a short 2-minute cooldown, you'll be able to use it quite a lot. However, if you do have access to raid gear and raid trinkets, I have some great options for you to run as a Subtlety Rogue. The Dribbling Impod, while might feel like it's not a great trinket, it's actually not a terrible one for single target or AoE situations. With Subtlety Rogue, most of the times you're going to be obliterating enemies before you can stack up Dribbling Impod, but this trinket does stack whenever you are not bursting on targets, allowing you a little bit extra damage. It also is really good for pure boss fights, whether it's Fortified Week or Tyrannical Week. The Ashwain's Razor Coral is another good one. I use this on Outlaw all the time. And while it might feel that you don't get the value of the crit with this trinket, if you're able to put up a Razor Coral on an enemy, kill that enemy, you still get the crit from the stacks after the enemy dies. Therefore, you can follow up with another stack on another enemy, execute him, the crit still stacks, and the bigger the trash pack, the more you can kill all the smaller adds, the more crit you can stack up. Also useful on boss fights. Another powerful trinket for sub-rogues is going to be Azara's Font of Power. Now this one needs to be channeled before a fight, but it's not really that difficult to play around. You simply would channel the Azara's Font of Power ahead of time before you go in for the big burst onto a boss fight or an enemy trash pack. It does mean you need to know the runs and need to know when is the best time to use this trinket, but if you're not sure, using it on cooldown inside of a dungeon run is probably the most advisable choice, at least when you start playing your sub-rogue. Let's talk about Azerite gear. Gear for Azerites is going to be very particular. You will need specific traits in order to make Subtlety work. First of all, Knight's Vengeance triple stack is what we'll be running in our gear. Knight's Vengeance on a Nightblade allows us to prime the next Eviscerate within 8 seconds to do far more damage per common point spent. That combined with all our other damage modifiers, from what our spec brings to trinkets, it gives us quite a bit of Eviscerate damage. So this one is mandatory. Outside of that, you have a couple other traits that are good to run. We're going to be grabbing a mixed bag of them in order to make our experience as Subtlety Rogue as, I guess, the most wholesome it can be. This is why we'll be picking up First Dance as one of our traits, allowing us extra common points, which gives us a little bit more flexibility with common point building. We have Replicating Shadows, which doesn't feel like it does a lot, but whenever it does proc, and the fact that it can replicate to other enemies in a trash pack does make it a little bit more viable. And finally, Inevitability allows our backstabs and Shadow Strike to extend the duration of Symbols of Death, great in boss fights. Now let's talk about some of the essences, and you will want to run specific essences in order to make Subtlety work. Blood of the Enemy rank 3 is recommended to be the on-use essence. Rank 3 is what you'll need in order to get those big bursts of damage in AoE situations or single target. Outside of Blood of the Enemy rank 3, it is advisable to run Memory of the Lucid Dream as one of your passives, and rank 3 Conflict and Strife as your other passive. This will offer you the best output for the burst damage, whether it's a single target situation or burst AoE. If you don't have these essences, Subtlety might be a little bit more of a lackluster experience. We are talking about a spec that is heavily overshadowed by Outlaw. It can do great damage in a right situation, so having best in slot essences is going to be almost a must. But trust me when I say this, the amount of damage Subtlety can put out with the best gear and the best essences is quite insane. Let's talk a bit about the AoE damage output for Subtlety. The AoE aspect of Sub-Rogue is going to be really easy to pick up, and this is where most of your damage is going to come from. Subtlety doesn't really have AoE damage, so instead you're going to be building common points and spamming those common points to do even more single target output. Your main rotation is going to consist of using Shuriken Storm to build common points, using Nightblade to prime your target for a stronger eviscerate, then going back to using Shuriken Storms to make sure you have full 6 common points even if you have to overdraw, and then proceeding with an eviscerate. Rinse and repeat. When it comes to using your cooldowns in AoE trash bags, the best advice anyone can give you is simply use things on cooldown. If there is a bigger trash bag that needs to be nuked and you can save most of your cooldowns for the biggest trash bag in order to have the most impact on your damage, then it's a good idea to save it. Outside of that, if there isn't a heavy trash bag that's coming up that needs those cooldowns in order to advance further throughout a dungeon, use everything on cooldown. That goes for Shadow Dance, Symbols of Death, and even Shadow Blades. Trinkets are a little bit different. They are a 2-minute cooldown, so with trinkets, I would save them for the big trash bags and maybe for a boss fight that's about to come up. Outside of that, use everything on cooldown as much as you can. The more we use these abilities on cooldown, the more value we'll get out of them in the long run. The cleave, or more a funnel playstyle, where you are building comm points off of enemies but funneling all of it into a singular target, works out in boss fights quite heavily. For any boss fight that has a bunch of adds that are generally not that threatening, you can ask your team, if you are in a Discord communication, to, hey, can you not kill these adds? I'm going to be using them to build comm points and funnel that into powerful eviscerates to slam around the boss. This is useful in some boss fights, and if you can ask your team, you'll get yourself a lot more value. If your team plays around what a sub-bro can do, some boss fights become a lot easier to handle, and even certain trash packs can become even easier if people simply play around your playstyle. For single target fights, it's not going to be that much different. You are also going to be doing the same thing with AoE. Your cooldowns should become eventually a little bit desyncopated, as in you won't have everything available at the same time. What a lot of guides for Subtlety rogues tell you is you should always use everything together. That means Symbols of Death and Shadow Blades and Shadow Dance, and never use them separately. You should always just combine everything into a massive damage sandwich. Instead, however, watching a bunch of Subtlety rogues play in Mythic Plus dungeons, for them it's most of the time perfectly fine if some of your cooldowns become desynced. You can still get quite a bit of damage out even if you don't have everything together, and for the most part in a dungeon run, the best way to output damage is to have things on cooldown. That means if you're able to use more Shadow Dances, more Symbols of Death inside of a dungeon, you are outputting the most amount of damage you can. Using your Shadow Blades on cooldown will allow you to get more Shadow Blades throughout a run. That means more uses of that cooldown and more damage and the common points that come with it. So if your cooldowns start to become a little bit desynced and you feel like you're not lining up everything together all in a single go, that is perfectly fine. You should more or less try to simply get used to the change in playstyle when it comes to Subtlety and the way that it plays for Mythic Plus dungeons, and it's perfectly fine for your cooldowns to be a little bit desynced from time to time. When you're playing your Subtlety rogue and you encounter a boss inside of Mythic Plus dungeons and you have every cooldown available, this is more or less what your rotation is going to look like. In the opener, you want to prime yourself with a Shadow Blades and any unused consumables like potions, and you're going to open up on the enemy with a Shadow Strike followed into a Nightblade. Afterwards, you pop a Backstab, which will generate your 2 combo points, and now you're primed for a big damage. You'll pop Symbols of Death, Blood of the Enemy, every unused trinket, as well as your Shadow Dance into a Shadow Strike. Now you should be at full combo points into a massive eviscerate and hope that that thing crits. Afterwards, double Shadow Strike into Secret Technique. Then you'll follow up with a Backstab, and you'll hold that Backstab until you have more energy. When you're close to 70 energy or so, pop a Nightblade into a Shadow Dance, into a Shadow Strike, follow that up by Eviscerate. Double Shadow Strike, Eviscerate. And then you'll start your rotation where you're trying to prime every eviscerate with a Nightblade. You'll basically want to set it up in a way where you will want to get yourself maybe a Backstab, and you can use a Nightblade on 2 combo points, 1 combo point, 3 combo points, whatever it may be. But if you have cooldowns like Symbols of Death or Shadow Dance available, in order to get yourself some energy, in order to get that eviscerate, you'll basically hold your energy, hold a couple of combo points to the enemy, Nightblade, and then you'll try to spam out as many combo points in order to get your 5 or 6 combo point eviscerate. Outside of that, you'll want to, if you don't have any abilities to prime, any cooldowns to work for the primes, you'll want to maintain a full 6 combo point Nightblade on the enemy, Backstab as often as you can, and eviscerate when you cap on combo points. But most of your gameplay will be spent trying to prime your eviscerates, which will result in really short boss fights. As Subtlety, what are you to expect from your Mythic Plus dungeon runs? You are by no means going to be atop of the DPS charts. You'll probably end up leaving that to a Fury Warrior or an Outlaw Rogue simply because they're more designed for it. Subtlety isn't designed for great, consistent AoE damage. Rather, it's designed for big bursts in a short moment, making certain trash bags a lot easier and certain boss fights with full cooldowns easier and faster done than usually. Even if your AoE damage isn't that great, that still shouldn't hold you back that much. You are a rogue, so by those credentials alone, you should be able to get into just about any Mythic Plus group and do quite well. The biggest issue I could see for someone getting started with Subtlety Rogue is you're going to be very gear dependent, but also essence dependent. There's a lot of factors that are needed in order to make the spec viable and do quite decent damage. Nobody's going to expect for you to be at the top of the damage charts, but you still need to put out considerable damage. And that takes practice, but more importantly, it takes the grind, it takes the essences, and it does take certain key pieces of gear in order to make the Subtlety dream come together. However, if you are someone who is lucky, or you do quite a bit of gearing on your own time, if you did do the Blood of the Enemy grind, since they did nerf it recently, you should be able to get into some dungeons as Subtlety. It is simply a playstyle option, but it is a viable playstyle option, and can even see itself play into some high level keys at the endgame content. So hopefully this video helps you guys get started if you do want to play some Subtlety for Mythic Plus. It's actually quite a fun playstyle, and I think a lot of people should give it a go if you have the gear for it. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed. Hope you guys enjoyed this guide on Subtlety Mythic Pluses, and I'll see all of you in another video.